All right, welcome back. Tonight is Monday, 7 o'clock or 7 p.m. lecture, and it's Monday the 16th. And we're getting close to finishing up the summer session. And actually, I was expecting I'd be doing a review for the final exam, but since no one is here with me, I'm going to instead do the lecture on Romanticism. So this is in Unit 8, and in Unit 8, we begin by talking about Romanticism. We kind of finish off Neoclassicism, and we follow Romanticism all the way to the start, or at least the hint of realism. And I think the first thing to understand is that Romanticism is an interesting topic compared to what we have been seeing because it's very much a self-conscious kind of purposely chosen art movement where artists were thinking to themselves, where is art going? What should it be looking like? I mean, it's not like a total break because I think we've already been seeing that when we were looking at the Rococo. There was kind of like a sense of artists purposefully shifting the direction of art there, and then especially when we get to neoclassicism, especially David really kind of like feeling like he as an artist was, you know, performing an act of reformation on art by changing the direction, by kind of like making a new kind of statement. And so that's part of what we need to know. But Romanticism is a little bit different from the other movements because it's rather unusual in that it's not very much about like what it looks like. That there's a lot of diversity in romantic art in terms of like there are artists who paint really tightly and there are artists who paint really loosely. There are artists who paint with really light value um, palettes and artists who paint with really dark, rich value palettes. There's artists who paint really thick and impasto and artists who paint really thin. There's not a lot of commonality visually to Romanticism, but there is a ton of commonality, ton of unity to Romanticism in terms of content and theme and subject matter and narrative. And Romanticism was very much a reaction to the sense that that the end of the Age of Enlightenment kind of ended sort of like in a sense of pessimism about human progress. A lot of this, I think, could be blamed on industrialization. That like in the high point of the Age of Enlightenment, there wasn't that much industrialization, and it looked like where we were going to be going next was going to be better. And then by the time we get into the start of the 19th century, we're seeing, we're seeing the start of factories, and it just feels like there's a lot of negative feelings about where society is going. So Romanticism is very much, like I said, about kind of subject matters, and we could kind of understand it to a certain degree by looking at all the different kinds of subject matters. But I think the best way to understand it is to start with the idea of who the artist is. Like Romanticism, as opposed to, I mean, as opposed to Neoclassicism and as opposed to the Rococo, Romanticism had a much more kind of clear idea of like who is the artist. From their point of view, the artist was this radical individual who was by definition kind of like separated and removed and in opposition to society. He was automatically in opposition to society because he saw things differently. He saw things in a radical new way. He was um, and so that sense of um, the the visionariness, the sense of sensitivity led to this idea of like the romantic artist as being kind of removed from society. I think a really good example would be um, the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Fall of the House of Usher, where the main character, like he's so literally super sensitive that he's like he is overwhelmed by sound and any kind of sensory stimulation. And so then, because the artist is in opposition, then the romantic art has to be about kind of the things removed. And so in romantic art, we see a lot of kind of interest in the tragic and catastrophes, in the exotic, the dark, grotesque, the macabre, right? Like so the Gothic and horror were developed originally in these periods. And so there's a longing for a romantic past in a lot of this, and a longing for kind of like a way to kind of for artists to sort of remove themselves and live in a small community. So that there's kind of a utopian sort of quality to this as well. All right, well, let's take a look. So we're going to start by looking at artists who are somewhat of precursors to Romanticism. We see that a little bit in Goya, especially in like things like his prints and um, but also some of his paintings, like his interest in the fantastical, his interest in the dark and brooding, um, is very much kind of showing us where Romanticism is going. And keep in mind, even like we saw, like looking all the way back to the middle of the Baroque, like we saw some examples of paintings by Rembrandt that I said were kind of proto romantic. And so also William Blake is a great example. And like William Blake is a really good example of this proto-romantic spirit, not only in that the imagery is has this proto-romantic vibe, but also he himself, this artist who is seen as he's seen as special, as visionary. He was both a poet and a visual artist, but he was also seen as automatically kind of like misunderstood by society. His interest in people like Milton, who also, were seen as kind of misunderstood by society. Fuseli was also kind of part of this group, this early period. He and Blake knew each other, and were both kind of like, moving towards this direction. This is probably the piece that most people are aware of for Fuseli, his painting, The Nightmare. And it is very much like it's like Romanticism has begun. I also wanted to show you this painting because in the last art historical lecture we looked at Joseph Wright um, of Derby, and there, like I talked about him as being kind of like this possible artist who really represents what the Age of Enlightenment art was or could have been. But here you can see that as even he was kind of picking up on the romantic vibes of the time period, right? In Romanticism, there's just a lot of interest in things like shipwrecks, a lot of interest in things like, secret spaces like caves. But at last we get to Friedrich, and Caspar Friedrich, in some ways, maybe is the first true romantic artist. And you can see a lot of it having in this painting here, right? The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, because it's like this is the most perfect example of all of these themes. The artist is alone, he's forging ahead, he alone can kind of like, see where we're going. He's in this very romantic landscape space, you know, the fog, the rocky cliff, and everything. And the imagery that he made, and once again, remember, there are certain themes that are very romantic, like the interest in shipwrecks. This is a shipwreck painting, by the way. It's very subtle. You don't notice it first, but there's the ship being crushed by the ice. Um, and so, or like this painting, which is also a perfect emblematic idea of what Romanticism was about, right? The lonely abandoned church with the graveyard. Remember that lonely mill that that I showed you of Rembrandt. Rembrandt also had a famous painting that was just of a Jewish cemetery, which also had a very kind of pre-romantic, proto-romantic kind of vibe to it. And so in the romantic we have like the interest in the gothic, in the horror, in and it's very moody, very emotional approach to art. But it's not all the same. Like I said, there's a lot of diversity. Like these very sunny paintings are also very much a product of Romanticism. This is so we have here Otto Runge, and then down along the side here are other people of the same group. He was belonged to a group called the Nazarenes, and this was a bunch of German artists who lived in Italy and were trying to kind of like revive the simplicity of Renaissance art and kind of like Renaissance and even pre-Renaissance piety. And this would be very influential also on some British painters known as the Pre-Raphaelites, kind of having this very same sort of goal of like going back to some ideal time. Another artist who for many people is like completely emblematic of Romanticism would be Turner. J.M.W. Turner was, I mean, one, very romantic in terms of like his interests in things like shipwrecks, catastrophes, cities burning down, right? So in this case, the burning of the House of Lords and Commons, um, and or like this painting of um, of a slave ship, right, in the middle of a storm. And he's also kind of emblematic of one of the directions that happens in Romanticism. Like I said, there's a lot of diversity in terms of the way people make the imagery and what the imagery looks like. Some are very tight, some are very loose. And Turner really kind of sets this idea of like a true romantic artist has to paint in a romantic way. He has to be loose and energetic and um, very gestural, right? Because it has to be coming out of the artist in a free sort of manner. So he paints like this very loose sort of manner that they almost become abstractions. They're so kind of like just more about the just the maelstrom and the storm and less about any kind of coherent sense of imagery and more about the mark making and the texture and the paint on the surface. And although he was also at times a little bit more restrained, right? Like, so this kind of painting. But once again, very much interested in these kinds of themes. And so my point is about Turner was that he's kind of like a representation of one sort of direction where Delacroix would also be part of this kind of direction where the idea is that the artist, the romantic artist, right? The artist needs to paint or needs to lay down the imagery, put down the marks in the same kind of romantic way as the romance of the imagery, of the themes, of the, but not everyone is like this. So Romanticism starts to spread all over Europe, and we start to see artists in as far away as Norway. So here we have Good, and his painting is a lot tighter than some of the painting we see in France or in Britain. And Hayez in Italy is even more tight, right? But he's still romantic because I mean, look at especially like the costuming, this interest in these kind of exotic sort of locales that and exotic time periods where they're really trying to recreate kind of like this is what it was like in, you know, the early Renaissance or even the late Gothic. So let's get to French Romanticism. So And this is really in some ways the high point. What happens in France is kind of like the big story about Romanticism. And one side of that story is Delacroix. And we've already seen Delacroix to a degree. We've seen him with Liberty Leading the People, which I discussed in Unit 6 in the lecture that was about art and power. Notice also he has a shipwreck painting that is also a cave painting, right? And so we have a lot of the same kind of themes. We have themes of like, let's go back, themes of the exotic. Here we have a lion hunt that's taking place somewhere, maybe in North Africa. Um, Interest in kind of people who are outside of the mainstream of society, right? This orphan girl at a cemetery. But at the same time, right, so this is going on with Delacroix. And remember, Delacroix, like I said, although he could, rein things in and paint a little bit tighter, he really loved, I mean, look how loose he's painting here. He loved to paint extremely loosely and gesturally. And it was very much kind of like part of the point of the romantic ideal for Delacroix and for the artists who were inspired by Delacroix, right? Where it's like being loose and gestural, making art quickly, the artist being about being inspired and visionary was an important part of it, um, but at the same time, we have someone like Aang. And you could easily understand Aang as being the non-romantic, right? Like that we had one artist like Delacroix who was the romantic artist, and Aang was just basically continuing the David style of neoclassicism. But my point is that Aang was not necessarily with these images, although you can see a bit of a hint of it in this self-portrait. Aang was just as much influenced by these kind of trends in towards romanticism. Like here, he's looking back to the past, the steel troubadour, right? He's looking at this kind of world of the Renaissance and trying to capture the Renaissance clothes. And this is an image of Raphael with apparently the woman who was his primary muse and lover. And let's move on, and I'll show you. And like the interest in the exotic, right? The interest in this case, like in the world of a Turkish harem, or an interest in the exotic in terms of like medieval piety, right? Like where it's the Virgin adoring, right? But she's not painted like she would have been in like he's imagining biblical times. He's imagining her as, as as she would be imagined in like late Gothic period. And just like even when he's doing these sort of classical kind of images, we see this kind of romantic mood. Like if you look at the way he's painting her body, the stretch, right, and the turn of the head, there's just a kind of a style to it, a sense of it being a little bit artificial and it being all about the mood that feels very romantic. Let's just go back one more time just to make sure we really look carefully at all of Delacroix, because it's a very important part of this lecture, like this, the contrast between Delacroix and then Ang. And both of these artists, right, were also doing, portraits and doing things a little bit more that are normal and expected, but they were both also very, like I said, very influenced by the romantic spirit of the time. And I don't think it's right to think of Aang as being an anti romanticist. He was just a different kind of romanticist. And Jericho, who unfortunately died relatively young, Jericho was kind of pushing yet another direction for romanticism, which would a direction that was more like realism. And that push towards realism would be taken up later with Courbet. But yeah, Jericho was had this much more this interest in um, and like I say over here, is what he's doing here, is it romantic or is it modernist? right? Because if Courbet was doing this, we would clearly say, or if Manet was clearly doing this, we would clearly say, oh, this is very modernist, this approach. But it's hard to say. Lastly, I want to just cover a little bit. I think this is the, yeah, just cover. If you remember earlier in the lecture, I talked about these German artists, the Nazarenes, living in Italy, and their desire to kind of like take art back to an earlier time. And it's an interesting thing about how, like, in Romanticism, there's both this desire to kind of go back and a desire to push forward, right? So, like, so you have an artist like Runge who's both interested in art being, going back to this kind of um innocence of the early Renaissance, but at the same time, trying to figure out ideas about color. He was obsessed with color theory, much like Turner was. And so it's both a kind of a push back and a push forward. But then we get, so the Nazarenes and their ambition was very influential on this group of British artists who also wanted to kind of like take art back to kind of, and literally the term pre-Raphaelite means to art before Raphael, like that the high Renaissance was kind of where things went wrong. And so we need to go back to the innocence of the early Renaissance. And and they were also kind of like the Nazarenes, very much interested in sort of removing themselves. They didn't live outside of England like the Nazarenes were Germans who lived in Italy. But what they did was they kind of moved off to these rural communities. And this is kind of also related to that kind of anti-industrialism sort of approach that was very much especially a part of British Romanticism. And this is, I think, the last painting of the set, and I think that this painting Ophelia is pretty amazing. And all right, that's the end. Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. And I think, yeah, I was the only one. So I'm gonna end the lecture at this point, and tomorrow, hopefully record a few others so we can continue to catch up on units 8 and unit 9. All right, thank you very much.